As of this month, this card has officially turned 8 years old. This is the GTX 980 Ti with 6GB of VRAM, 384-bit bus, and 2,816 CUDA cores. Believe it or not, this card will still hold up at 1080p in modern titles, so that's what we're going to be testing today. The first thing we got to do before we start running benchmarks is rip out this potential fire hazard, thanks NVIDIA, and throw in the GTX 980 Ti. This 980 Ti is a Hall of Fame edition, as you can see by the letters on the side, and is made by the company Galax. This card is very nice looking and complements the aesthetic of this white Inwin Tau case. Lastly, I'll mention that this card specifically is not from the United States and is only about 2 to 3% faster than the rest of the other 980 Ti's. Starting out with 2023's least optimized game, Jedi Survivor actually runs pretty good. 45 average FPS at all low settings 1080p on the 980 Ti is doable, but as you can see that the RAM is spilling over into system memory. So even at low settings, we are seeing a huge bottleneck in the memory. But jumping to the balanced setting on FSR and turning the texture up to medium makes this game's visuals a lot better, and the actual frame rate goes up quite a bit to an average 69 FPS. This is a very playable experience and so surprising for an 8-year-old card. Using this open area and running a side-by-side comparison with low FSR off versus medium textures FSR on, you can see that the game looks much better and plays better. Up next we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. This is running at 1080p with the balanced preset. One thing to note is that the percentage utilization kind of jumps between 95 to 100. I'm not sure why it does this, to be honest, but the game runs pretty smooth at around 65 to 75 FPS without FSR or any upscaling techniques. One thing you'll notice while using native resolution is that the game can look pretty grainy at this setting, but just by enabling FSR 2.0, you get a more smooth texture and overall a better picture. Running the in-game benchmark, you can see on the left with FSR on, there are some slight changes, about 2 to 3 FPS overall, but nothing drastically to make the game more playable. I would say enabling FSR makes the game actually just look a little bit better. With native resolution on the right, we get an average frame rate of 62 FPS with a 1% low of 42. And then on the left, we have FSR with an average 65 FPS and 45 FPS for the 1% low. Up next, we have the Last of Us PC port, which is notorious for running pretty bad on lower end hardware, but just recently they had a pretty big patch that solved quite a few problems. So we're running this game at 1080p resolution with all low settings and FSR off at the moment. The average frame rate on the 980 Ti in this game is around 55 FPS, which is actually pretty playable, but will drop into the 40s when you're under heavy gunfight. There are also pretty bad 1% lows and stutters prevalent throughout the entire game. Turning FSR on does appear to bring up the 1% lows and stuttering, and also cleans up the image quite a bit, but it does not improve the actual frame rate too much, as you'll see here in a minute. You'll also notice that the frame rate indoors is often pretty good, but here in this gunfight peeking out a window, you can start to see the FPS dip down into the lower 50s. This doesn't always happen, but when it does make the game feel kind of unplayable at times. Jumping back to 1080p with FSR off, you can see quite a few things here in this shot. Specifically, Joel's shirt and the shadows are artifacting a lot, which is kind of distracting, and I think overall looks pretty rough. If we switch FSR on, it seems to clean up the image a little bit, but it's still there and it's still quite distracting. You can also see weird things off in the distance with FSR. If you look here, there's a little piece of metal in the water, and there's quite a bit of artifacting going on around the edges. The one thing I'll say about The Last of Us is it's designed to be played at a slower pace, so it's not like you're in a Twitch shooter trying to get the highest frame rate. The game overall is just fun and is very playable on this card, even with the slight FPS drops that I had mentioned before. So if you can look past that stuff, it's actually a pretty decent experience considering how old this video card is. Jumping over to CYBERPUNK, we're starting off at 1080p with the low preset, but we're not using FSR at the moment, just to get a baseline to see how this game runs. Going into cluttered areas like this makes the frame rate dip quite a bit. There are some stutters, and overall we're seeing around a 50 FPS mark, but let's turn FSR on. With FSR on in this specific location, we're getting above 60 FPS, and we're even going into the 70s, which is pretty nice. But this game is a little bit tough to benchmark because it can change so frequently. Since we are getting pretty decent performance though, I'm going to bump the settings up to the medium preset and then enable FSR balanced instead of quality. So let's see what that looks like and plays like as we enter Night City. And just as I said before, we are now into the low to mid 40s, which is still completely playable, but not the best experience. So what I think I'm going to do is actually turn on performance mode and see how that works. Turning on performance mode did increase the frame rate about 10 frames per second on average, but the visual quality has kind of gone down quite a bit. Performance really renders the image at a very, very low resolution and upscales it with AI, but you're seeing quite a lot of artifacting and strange behavior in the game. So instead of giving you guys the average frame rate and numbers based off of MSI Afterburner, which is what I have done in previous games, I'm going to use the in-game benchmark at these settings. You guys can copy those settings if you have this specific card. I feel like going a little bit under spec on this card is a better idea because it will be more stable when you enter areas like Night City or any places that have large crowds that cause the frame rate to dip. Now this benchmark does a pretty good job of averaging everything in the game together, but it does miss some major parts. Just like I said before, the center of Night City, right around some of the tallest buildings where there are lots of neon signs, is where you get those really, really low frame rates dropping into the 40s and 50s. So just keep that in mind, and that's why I'm actually leaving the settings a bit lower so that you get a more stable experience going into those parts of the game. So before jumping into my last game I want to benchmark, I wanted to also add in this really quickly. This is Battlebit Remastered, which is like a Call of Duty clone that looks like Minecraft. It actually plays pretty good. I had VSync off and it's still capped out at my monitor. I'm not sure if that's a setting with the game, but I pretty much averaged exactly what my monitor settings are, 165 Hz at 1440p on the 980 Ti. So this was a really fun experience, and I feel like is a good representation of what this card should be used for. Mostly esports or lower end games like this are best played on a 980 Ti. I should probably also mention that I am running this at the highest settings that this game allows, and there's probably some way to turn off that VSync cap, but as of right now it's running 165 FPS, pretty much locked, with a few little dips here and there, but overall the experience is awesome. Definitely can recommend this game for this card. And lastly, we have Fortnite running at 1080p on a competitive mode setting with FXAA on and epic draw distance all the way up with textures on high. Now just looking at the frame rate, it looks like we get a really good experience, but Fortnite can be a little bit shifty. It can run at a really good frame rate but have tons of 1% lows and stutters, especially if you're just booting up the game with a new card installed for the first time. I wait around 20 minutes or play a couple of matches before actually recording anything to smooth out some of those background shader installations. I played a total of 7 matches on Battle Royale solos to get an average of 140 FPS and 1% lows of 105. This game runs pretty good. The stuttering did go away eventually, and this card is actually decent at 1080p for this game. I do tend to prefer a cleaner, sharper image and have a frame rate around 100 FPS, but if you want a higher frame rate around 200 FPS, you can easily do that by lowering your in-game settings to low and turning the render resolution down a little bit. So what is the conclusion on this video card in 2023? Well, I think if you can find one for very cheap, it's a pretty decent card for esports titles, but I would stay away from it if you're looking to do any higher end gaming or video editing. So one other thing I did with this card during the last week or so was use it pretty much for all of my video edits, which became a little bit troubling because one, it does not have AV1 or even H.264. You can only use certain encoders to edit video. Things like moving the timeline and scrolling through or even small splices can be a little bit of a challenge. The VRAM limitation is also a problem. 1080p is fine, but going above 1080p is obviously going to be a problem. It does serve as a card for video editing if you really needed it to, but I wouldn't suggest it over something with more VRAM or newer. So my final opinion on the 980 Ti in 2023 is it's cool to collect, but I really wouldn't buy it for anything other than maybe some esports titles if you can find it super cheap. If you guys liked this video, drop a like, leave a comment, it really helps me out, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.